I guess if someone were really trying to stabilize this, um, it would start with changing the structure of spending around Social Security, Medicare, and defense. You have to kind of go blank sheet of paper. Do we need 800 foreign military bases? Is that keeping us safer or no? And what's the cost of all that? That's that kind of thing. Then it's like, okay, so we have systematically kind of made our food less healthy, and now it's kind of ballooning into really high healthcare expenses on a per capita basis. If you look at Japan, I mean, they're going through a significant aging problem. They're much more aged than us, but they spend something like a third per capita on healthcare.
Renowned macro analyst Lyn Alden uses a meme to depict the current state and trajectory of the U.S. economy, showing a bus on a rail track with a train approaching. The bus represents the past 40 years of market behavior, which were characterized by monetary dominance. In the meme's second frame, the bus is destroyed by the fiscal dominance train. Alden suggests that our long-held beliefs about the economy and markets, shaped during this era, are now obsolete. During the monetary dominance period, monetary policy was effective because most money creation came from bank lending, allowing central banks to either stimulate or slow down the economy as needed. However, Alden argues that the US and much of the developed world have now entered an era of fiscal dominance, marked by large debts and fiscal deficits. Central banks like the Federal Reserve no longer have the appropriate tools to manage the economy effectively, as their options are constrained by fiscal policies. Raising or lowering interest rates does not impact fiscal dynamics in the same way it affects bank lending and credit creation. Alden warns that metrics important during the monetary dominance era will likely be less relevant moving forward, and the situation is nearly out of control. The only viable solution, austerity measures to restore balance, is politically unfeasible. In a recent interview with Anthony Scaramucci, CEO of Skybridge Capital, Alden discussed how the U.S. economy is on an unsustainable path. She concluded with a stark warning: nothing stops this train. This highlights the challenges ahead as the economy navigates the shift from monetary to fiscal dominance, with central banks' traditional tools becoming increasingly ineffective.
Stop. You don't have time. Don't miss out this 2025 bull run. Educate yourself first ahead of the crowd. We have created the ultimate step-by-step crypto cheat guide that will guide you this bull run. Unlock the secrets of crypto and make smarter investments today. Now by clicking on the link below to get your exclusive copy just under $10.
During the pandemic, Powell called for more stimulus. So we kind of crossed the line where normally monetary policymakers don't, as a general rule, they don't really comment on fiscal policy. They try to be not kind of directly partisan. But he said, we've used a lot of our tools. There needs to be some fiscal support, right? So he crossed that line in that instance. What I would say now is that what we're seeing on the other side of it is that there's this kind of overflowing amount of fiscal hitting the market. But he's very reticent to comment on the fiscal side because he kind of goes back to the position of not really seeing that his position. But I think at this point, a central banker, if they're trying to be kind of intellectually honest about this, is time to say it's hard to do any of my mandates when deficits are this structurally big. Because a central bank's tools are primarily designed around accelerating bank lending or decelerating bank lending. That's really what they're mostly geared toward. And we're in a fiscal dominant environment now, meaning that ongoing typical yearly fiscal deficits exceed the amount of new bank loan creation. And so those fiscal deficits are kind of a bigger impact on the economy in many ways than those bank loans. And they can drive things like inflation. They can drive things like nominal GDP running hot with some of the inflationary consequences that come from that. And basically it's saying, look, I don't really have the tools to deal with what's happening there. And so if you want those mandates to be in any way met, there has to be a fiscal response. And so right now it's kind of politically acceptable for central bankers or treasury officials to say, look, in the long run of time, yes, there's a fiscal issue, but but then they always caveat by saying, we still have plenty of room. No one's going to admit that the actual road is kind of running into issues under their watch. And I think that there needs to be more transparency around that issue. So I basically would say, look, if you want me to be able to do my job, you need to rein in yours a little bit. Otherwise, I would resign and say, look, you put me in a position where I can't meet my mandate because I don't have the tools to meet my mandates. I guess if someone were really trying to stabilize this, it would start with changing the structure of spending around Social Security, Medicare, and defense. You have to kind of go blank sheet of paper. Do we need 800 foreign military bases? Is that keeping us safer or no? And what's the cost of all that? That's that kind of thing. Then it's like, okay, so we have systematically kind of made our food less healthy, and now it's kind of ballooning into really high healthcare expenses on a per capita basis. If you look at Japan, I mean, they're going through a significant aging problem. They're much more aged than us, but they spend something like a third per capita on healthcare and get better outcomes. So clearly, we have a kind of a healthcare spending
Is that a
crisis.
polite way of saying that the Japanese are less fat than the Americans? Is that a polite way of saying it?
That is a big contributor to it. It's eating habits, but it's also we have a very processed food industry. So it's not like one group just their willpower gave way over a short period of time. It's the combination of human nature with this very processed um, kind of background structure that makes it all the hard choices are just really, really easy to make. So it's our food, both individual decisions, food structure, the way we kind of structure healthcare payments, all of that results in basically just a completely ballooning healthcare expense. Then you can do things like mean test Social Security. I mean, there's ways you can at least try to get that back somewhat on the track. But the problem, I mean, the chance of any of this happening, especially all of it happening together, is exceptionally low. And so I think that's structurally it's going to be very, very hard for any politician, even well-meaning ones, to do that. And even if they get elected on that, probably as soon as they start enacting some of that, they would not win a second.
Alden's first observation is that reckless government spending and borrowing hinders central banks from effectively carrying out their tasks. She believes that an urgent discussion is needed and immediate steps must be taken to prevent an impending collapse. However, those in power continue to mislead the public, insisting that everything is under control. The closest acknowledgement of the problem from Fed Chair Jerome Powell came when he admitted that the U.S. is on an unsustainable fiscal path. Powell's solution is for politicians to have a serious discussion about the issue. He stated that the U.S. federal government is on an unsustainable fiscal path, meaning the debt is growing faster than the economy, which is inherently unsustainable. Powell emphasized the need to get back on a sustainable fiscal path, calling for an adult conversation among elected officials to address the problem. Powell's words may downplay the urgency of the situation, but experts like Alden believe it is even more dire than it appears. The critical need for immediate and effective action is clear, despite the reassurances from those in power.
So the last time that developed markets ran into a debt crisis was really back in the 1940s. We also see emerging markets run into them today. And so combining, kind of what's happening mathematically today, what happened in the past, that gives us some view of what this kind of thing looks like. Obviously, technology is different, culture is different. There's all sorts of details. Basically, I would say that you start to get certain emerging market characteristics in even a developed country when you run into fiscal problems. So it's not like all the crisis happens at once. It's not like you have a pre-crisis and then a post-crisis. Instead, it tends to be a bunch of events that kind of culminate together. And so a key thing that it starts out with is the central bank losing control of its own balance sheet, that it's unable to ever kind of retain it back down, and they find themselves structurally monetizing fiscal debt and always explaining why they're not really doing that, but their balance sheet's, kind of going up cycle by cycle anyway at a faster rate than it used to. And so that's kind of the first step. I would say that we've been in kind of that fiscal dominant situation since around 2019. Ever since we had the repo crisis that probably most audience viewers aren't familiar with, but there was a kind of a financial plumbing issue in September 2019. I would say that kind of marks probably some of the earlier effects of fiscal dominance. And that wasn't a crisis in the sense that people didn't feel it, but you had that, and then you had the pandemic, and then you had the bank issue of 2023. You had the gilt crisis of late 2022. Over time, these things kind of add up. So basically, what it looks like is the difficulty of hitting a persistent 2% inflation target, which by the way that's only added recently. I mean, their definition of price stability they define as 2% inflation. It doesn't have to be 2%. They could aim for zero, but they don't. But basically, their own target is 2%. The way they measure it, you get a challenge of ever kind of sustainably getting back there. You get money supply growth that is continuing to be significant, an inability to raise rates as much as they want to in the face of persistent inflation, the ineffectiveness of those rates, because again, bank lending is not the main issue. Fiscal deficits are the bigger component of the inflation that's happening. You see more protectionism. You see kind of like narratives like in emerging markets, they'll say, look, it's not our fault the currency's problem, it's outside speculators are attacking it, or people are hoarding it, or you kind of put the blame on some outside entity or or some small unpopular entity, maybe you kind of wealthy people in general, kind of a vague group, and you say, look, that's why our currency is weakening. The outsiders, the wealthy, whatever the case may
Yeah,
be.
scapegoat. You got to have a scapegoat.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I think basically you see years and years and years of that. Now, some of the more kind of acute crisis happened, for example, in the mid 2030s, the Social Security fund runs out. And so if that's not addressed in some way on either the spending or the revenue side, then basically people would only get a certain percentage of their expected benefits after
Mhm.
that point. It would only be fed by current tax revenue rather than the existing fund. So you start to get these kind of mini crises along the way, but it didn't just go from normal to Mad Max. It
Right.
basically, anyone who studies emerging markets sees like a slow kind of train of events.
So investors want to know this, and it's a very simplistic question, but I'm going to ask it. Are we going to be okay?
I think we'll be okay. I think you have to position yourself to be as okay as possible. I think you wanna prepare yourself, prepare your own situation, prepare your portfolio. In any sort of changing times, there are always some people that are okay and not okay. I mean that's true for any period of time. But basically, major changes in currency cycles are not the end of the world. They're just an end of how certain things existed for a number of decades, and then there's some sort of realignment, and then it's in place for another several decades. So it is, I would say it's disruptive, but there are multiple ways to be okay on the other.
The U.S. national debt crossed the $1 trillion mark on October 1, 1981. During that time, there were many discussions about an impending collapse. However, certain factors, including rapid globalization, a significant increase in productivity with about 1 billion people entering the labor force, lower interest rates, and peak demographics, helped the U.S. avoid lasting damage. Unfortunately, many people compare that period to today, using it as a basis to predict that the U.S., especially as the issuer of the world's reserve currency, will be able to survive and thrive indefinitely without consequences. Alden argues that the problems are not only re-emerging today but have worsened due to a much larger debt-to-GDP ratio. Unlike the 80s and 90s, the factors that help the economy stay afloat are either unraveling quickly or happening at a much slower pace than before. As a result, Alden explains that the U.S. economy is now in a very precarious situation, teetering on the edge of disaster. She recommends that investors protect themselves against the coming crisis by investing in Bitcoin, one of the few assets that has significantly outperformed currency debasement, and is expected to continue doing so. What are your thoughts on Lyn Alden's assessment of the current state of the United States economy, and what lies ahead? Please share your comments and observations below. For more Daily Dose Crypto news, check out these 2 awesome videos on your screen. Click now and we will see you on the next video.